The giant leap for mankind could have been the hoax of the century.
Neil Armstrong is no stranger to making headlines. From his iconic words of "that's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind," to making history as the first person to land on the moon, Neil is truly a legend. But beyond the impressive moon exploration, there's more to the story than we've been told. In a recent podcast episode, Joe Rogan addressed something strange he noticed in the clip of the first moon landing. It has made many researchers and the general public go back to that one clip and make Neil Armstrong's confirmation of what we thought all along to suddenly surface. Brace yourself, because what we're about to reveal might make you question what you've always known about man's first landing on the moon. His childhood and early years of his career. Neil Armstrong is a name that needs no introduction. He made history by becoming the first person to ever walk on the moon. Born on August 5, 1930, Neil Armstrong's roots are closely tied to aviation history. He was born less than 60 meters from the Wright brothers' workshop. Neil's parents were Viola Louise and Stephen Koenig Armstrong. He was of German English, Scots-Irish, and Scottish descent. He had a younger sister named June and a younger brother named Dean. His father worked as an auditor for the Ohio state government, which meant the family moved around a lot, living in 16 different towns in just 14 years. Neil's love for flying started at a young age. When he was just 2 years old, his father took him to the Cleveland air races. By the time he was 5 or 6, he had his first flight experience in Warren, Ohio, when he and his father rode in a Ford Trimotor, also known as the Tin Goose. His passion for flying only grew stronger with time. At the age of 16, even before he got his driver's license, Neil successfully earned his pilot's license. In 1947, he attended Purdue University on a naval scholarship, studying aeronautical engineering. As part of his scholarship, he was trained as a fighter pilot by the Navy in Florida. During the Korean War, Neil flew 78 combat missions. His aircraft, the F-9 Panther jet, was one of the first jet fighters to launch from a carrier. After completing college, Neil Armstrong began working for the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, which later became NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. In 1958, this mild-mannered kid from Ohio made a name for himself as one of the most daring and skilled test pilots at NASA's Flight Research Center, which is now named after him. Over the course of 7 years as a test pilot at the Edwards Air Force Base in California, Neil flew 200 different aircraft, pushing the limits of speed and altitude, including the legendary X-15 high over the California desert. There's more to this legend's achievements. He reached a speed of more than 4,000 miles per hour, taking the needle-nosed X-15 to the edge of space. Neil Armstrong's steady hands as a test pilot were crucial to NASA's first Mercury astronaut's success, and soon he would become one of them. In 1962, he was selected for NASA's astronaut training program in Houston, but it was at this point that his wife Janet lost their second child, a 2-year-old daughter named Karen, to an inoperable brain tumor. To avoid being consumed by grief, Armstrong threw himself into his work, preparing for the Gemini program, NASA's next step toward reaching the moon. In 1966, he was chosen as the command pilot for the Gemini 8 mission, when NASA astronauts would attempt to connect 2 spacecraft in orbit. This was a difficult and dangerous maneuver known as rendezvous and docking. Armstrong and his co-pilot, David Scott, successfully docked with an unmanned aerial target vehicle. But soon after, their spacecraft began to spin uncontrollably due to a malfunctioning thruster. Armstrong eventually stabilized the Gemini 8 by using the re-entry control system, but they had to abort the mission and make an emergency landing in the Pacific Ocean. It was a close call, but Armstrong's calmness and quick thinking saved the day. His next and final mission was the one that would immortalize him forever. He was chosen as the commander of Apollo 11, the first manned mission to land on the moon. How did humans get to the moon? What struggles did they face on their journey? What could have gone wrong? And what did go wrong? How about we find out? The first flight to the moon. The initial crew assignment for the Apollo 9 backup crew was officially announced on November 20th, 1967. Commander Neil Armstrong, Command Module pilot Jim Lovell, and lunar module pilot Buzz Aldrin were named as the backup crew. Lovell and Aldrin had previously flown together as the crew of Gemini 12. Due to design and manufacturing delays in the lunar module, the prime and backup crews of Apollo 8 and Apollo 9 swapped places. Armstrong's crew became the backup for Apollo 8. Following the normal crew rotation scheme, Armstrong was then expected to command Apollo 11, but there was a sudden change in plans. Michael Collins, the CMP on the Apollo 8 crew, began experiencing trouble with his legs. Doctors diagnosed the problem as a bony growth between his fifth and sixth vertebrae, requiring surgery. Lovell took Collins's place on the Apollo 8 crew, and when Collins recovered, he joined Armstrong's crew as CMP. In the meantime, Fred Haise filled in as the backup LMP and Aldrin as the backup CMP for Apollo 8. Apollo 11 was the second American mission where all the crew members had prior spaceflight experience, the first being Apollo 10. The next mission with a fully experienced crew was STS-26 in 1988. Deke Slayton gave Armstrong the option to replace Aldrin with Lovell, as some thought Aldrin was difficult to work with. Armstrong, however, had no issues working with Aldrin. He thought it over for a day before declining, believing Lovell deserved to command his own mission. The Apollo 11 prime crew did not share the close, cheerful camaraderie characterized by that of Apollo 12. Instead, they had a friendly, working relationship. Armstrong, in particular, was known to be taciturn, but Collins, who considered himself a loner, admitted to dismissing Aldrin's attempts to create a more personal relationship. Aldrin and Collins described the crew as amiable strangers, but Armstrong did not agree with this assessment and said that all the crews he was on worked very well together. On July 16, 1969, the Saturn V rocket took off in Florida, watched by millions of people on television. 4 days later, Armstrong and Aldrin separated from the command module and entered the lunar module Eagle to begin the final preparations for lunar descent. At 1744, Eagle separated from Columbia. Alone on Columbia, Collins checked Eagle as it spun in front of him to make sure it wasn't broken and that the landing gear was out. Armstrong said Eagle had wings. When they started to land, Armstrong and Aldrin saw landmarks on the surface too soon and said they were going to land miles from where they wanted to. Eagle was going too fast. The problem might have been big concentrations of stuff under the moon's surface that messed with Eagle's path. Gene Kranz, the boss of the flight, thought maybe there was too much air in the tunnel that connected Eagle to Columbia, or maybe Eagle spun too much. 5 minutes into landing, 6,000 feet above the moon, the computer on Eagle beeped a couple of times, scaring the crew. A guy named Jack Garman in the control room said it was okay to keep going, but the computer was busy and couldn't do everything at once. Armstrong looked out again and saw they were going to land near a big crater, so he did something brave. He took control. He thought about landing before the crater to collect some rocks, but they were going too fast sideways. Aldrin kept telling Armstrong where they were going, while Armstrong flew Eagle. When they were 107 feet above the surface, Armstrong knew they were almost out of fuel and wanted to land quickly. He found a nice spot, but then saw a crater there. He moved Eagle over the crater and found another good spot. They were only 100 feet from the surface now, and they had only 90 seconds of fuel left. Dust from the engine made it hard for Armstrong to see what Eagle was doing. Armstrong looked at some big rocks sticking out of the dust to figure out how fast Eagle was going as he landed. Then a light came on, telling Aldrin that at least one of the probes hanging from Eagle's feet had touched the ground just before they landed. So he said they had contact. Armstrong was supposed to turn off the engine right away because the engineers thought the pressure from the engine's exhaust bouncing off the moon could make it blow up, but he forgot. Apollo 11 used a special kind of TV that couldn't be shown on regular TV, so it had to be shown on a special monitor. Then a regular TV camera filmed that monitor, which made the picture not as good. The signal was sent to Goldstone in the United States, but it was clearer at Honeysuckle Creek Tracking Station near Canberra in Australia. Later, they switched to the Parkes radio telescope in Australia which was even better. Even though there were some technical and weather problems, they were able to send black and white pictures of the first time someone walked on the moon to at least 600 million people on Earth. Copies of this video are easy to find, but the original video from the moon was probably erased and used again by NASA. It doesn't end there. During the splashdown, Columbia flipped over, but the astronauts quickly used special bags to turn it the right way up in just 10 minutes. A diver from a Navy helicopter above attached a big float to stop it from drifting away. More divers fixed things to keep the module steady and put out rafts to help the astronauts get out. On August 13th, the three astronauts had big parades in New York and Chicago. About 6 million people watched. That same evening in Los Angeles, there was a fancy dinner to celebrate the flight. Many important people were there, like members of Congress, 44 governors, and the Chief Justice of the United States. There were also ambassadors from 83 countries at the Century Plaza Hotel. Nixon and Agnew gave each astronaut a special medal called the Presidential Medal of Freedom. On September 16, 1969, the three astronauts talked to both parts of Congress. They gave one U.S. flag to the House of Representatives and another one to the Senate. They had taken these flags to the moon with them. The flag from American Samoa that was on Apollo 11 is now in a museum in Pago Pago, the capital of American Samoa. This big celebration started a 38-day trip around the world. They went to 22 countries and met many world leaders. They traveled from September 29th to November 5th. Joe Rogan's conspiracy theory. Many people think the moon landing was fake, and one of them is Joe Rogan, who has a famous podcast. Rogan says that when the United States flag was put on the moon, it looked like it was waving. But there's no wind in space, so why was the flag moving? Some people think the flag was attached to a wire and a fan, and the whole thing was filmed on Earth. They say this shows that NASA made up the moon landing to trick everyone and beat the Soviet Union in the space race. There was a big competition at that time between the United States and the Soviet Union. Some think the United States made up the moon landing to win that race. Maybe that's why Neil Armstrong quit NASA after that. In a strange twist, a former worker from Rocketdyne, the company that made the Saturn V rockets, said he had secret information that the moon landing was fake. He said the flag was one of the clues that showed it was all a lie. Some people believe the United States made it up to win the space race. People have also asked questions about the pictures that came from the moon trip. Why can't we see any stars in the sky? The moon is high up in space, so there should be stars in the pictures from NASA. In one picture from the moon landing, you can see Armstrong's reflection in Aldrin's visor. Some people say Armstrong doesn't look like he's holding a camera, so someone else must have taken the picture. But NASA says only Armstrong and Aldrin went on the trip. This makes some people doubt NASA and the US government. In the pictures from the moon landing, you can see some things even though they are in the shade. Skeptics say if the sun was the only light source, you shouldn't be able to see these things. So they think special lights like the ones used in Hollywood were used to make these pictures. One of the most famous pictures shows a rock on the moon with the letter C on it. Some people think this means most of the big rocks on the moon are fake, like props in a movie. They think someone labeled this rock with a letter and forgot to turn it over before taking the picture. In the early 1980s, there was a fake story that said Armstrong became a Muslim after he heard the call to prayer on the moon. Suhaimi, a singer from Indonesia, wrote a song called Gema Suara Adzan di Bulan, which means the resonant sound of the call to prayer on the moon. This song talked about Armstrong supposedly becoming a Muslim. Jakarta News talked a lot about this song in 1983. Similar fake stories were also heard in Egypt and Malaysia. In March 1983, the US State Department told embassies and consulates in Muslim countries that Armstrong didn't become a Muslim. People kept talking about this fake story for the next 30 years. Some of the confusion came from the name of Lebanon, a country with mostly Muslim people, and Lebanon, Ohio, where Armstrong lived. Armstrong liked flying small planes for fun. He loved flying gliders and had earned a special badge before he went to the moon. Even when he was in his 70s, he still liked flying without an engine. Then something unfortunate happened. In November 1978, while working on his farm, Armstrong got his wedding ring caught in the wheel of his truck. In February 1991, he had a small heart attack while skiing with friends in Aspen, Colorado. Armstrong had heart surgery on August 7, 2012, at Mercy Faith Fairfield Hospital in Cincinnati to fix his heart. He seemed to be getting better, but he had problems and died on August 25th when he was 82 years old. President Barack Obama said Armstrong was one of the greatest American heroes, not just of his time, but of all time. He said Armstrong showed what Americans can achieve and that his moment on the moon will always be remembered. Armstrong's family said he didn't like being called a hero, but he was proud to serve his country as a Navy pilot, test pilot, and astronaut. They said they were sad he was gone, but happy he had such an amazing life. They hoped other young people would follow their dreams, explore, and help others, just like Armstrong did. If you want to honor Neil, here's what you can do. Think about his service, his achievements, and how humble he was. The next time you see the moon shining down on you on a clear night, think of Neil Armstrong and give him a little wink. This idea got a lot of attention, even on Twitter, with the hashtag #WinkAtTheMoon. Buzz Aldrin called Neil a true American hero and the best pilot he ever knew. He was sad they couldn't celebrate the 50th anniversary of the moon landing together in 2019. Michael Collins said Neil was the best, and he would miss him a lot. NASA's administrator Charles Bolden has said Neil Armstrong will always be in history books and be remembered for being the first person to step on a world that's not our own. In July 2019, after the 50th anniversary of the moon landing, the New York Times talked about a lawsuit that Armstrong's family filed against the hospital where he died. Armstrong's wife, Carol, didn't join the lawsuit. She thought Neil wouldn't want them to sue. Neil Armstrong was a member of the National Academy of Engineering because of all he did in space and for science. He joined the American Philosophical Society in 2001. Armstrong and his Apollo 11 friends got the Langley Gold Medal from the Smithsonian Institution in 1999. On April 18, 2006, NASA gave him the Ambassador of Exploration Award. The Space Foundation gave him the General James E. Hill Lifetime Space Achievement Award in 2013. He was inducted into the Aerospace Walk of Honor, the International Space Hall of Fame, the National Aviation Hall of Fame, and the United States Astronaut Hall of Fame. He got his Naval Astronaut badge in 2010 on the USS Dwight D. Eisenhower. There's a crater on the moon and an asteroid named after him. There are numerous schools, streets, buildings, and other places named after him all over the world. There's a museum about air and space in his hometown, Wapakoneta, called the Armstrong Air and Space Museum. There's also an airport named after him in New Knoxville, Ohio. That's not all. There's a mineral called Armstrongite and another one called Armalcolite, partly named after him. Purdue University named their engineering building after him in 2004. In 2014, NASA renamed the Dryden Flight Research Center to the NASA Neil A. Armstrong Flight Research Center. In 2012, the U.S. Navy named their first Armstrong-class ship RV Neil Armstrong. In 2018, Neil Armstrong's sons sold some of his things, like his Boy Scout cap, flags, and medals from his space trips. They made $5.2 million in 3 days. By July 2019, they made $16.7 million. Some wood and fabric from the Wright Flyer that Armstrong took to the moon was sold for a huge amount of money too. His wife, Carol, on the other hand, didn't sell anything. She gave his papers to Purdue University. In May 2019, she gave 2 pieces of fabric from the Wright Flyer and Neil's letters about them to Purdue too. Do you still think about man's first exploration on the moon? And what do you think about Joe Rogan's conspiracy theory? share with us in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like, share it with your family and friends, and subscribe to our channel. Until next time.